Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the scratchy blankets of the past to explore how kids slept, played, and got scolded in ancient times. You'll shuffle through dusty courtyards, try not to trip on a bone toy, and fall asleep to lullabies that sound more like mild threats. You'll get tucked into a cradle made of reeds or, if you're unlucky, just some straw in the corner next to a goat named Thelma. And before you complain about your memory foam not being soft enough, just wait till you hear what ancient kids had for pillows. Spoiler, sometimes it was a rock. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself lying in a bed. Or, at least, it's supposed to be one. But it creaks like a tree branch and smells faintly of goat and herbs. Welcome to your wicker cradle woven from reeds, branches, and whatever wasn't being used to start a cooking fire. You're not alone. Around you are other tiny body siblings, cousins, maybe a neighbor's kid whose parents had too many already. In many ancient homes, space was not divided by walls, but by how many feet you could physically push someone away. In ancient Egypt, wealthier children might be laid in small wooden beds carved from acacia or cedar, with soft lion wrappings and amulets dangling overhead to ward off nightmares. But let's be real, you're probably not royalty. You're more likely swaddled in wool strips, lying in a cradle stuffed with straw, moss, or whatever plant matter seemed least pokey that season. And the cradle? It's on the floor, maybe near the hearth if you're lucky, because nighttime is cold and fire was your ancient version of a heated blanket. In colder regions, like Iron Age Northern Europe, babies sometimes slept in animal hide slings hung near the fire, gently swaying in the smoky warmth. You might imagine this was peaceful until someone starts snoring or the dog mistakes you for a meat parcel. Sleep wasn't silent, either. Adults told stories or gossiped well into the night. And those homes. No insulation. You heard everything. Someone chewing. Someone sleep-talking. Someone coughing their way through a medieval cold, which probably involved bloodletting and prayer. Now here's a fun fringe detail. In some parts of the ancient world, people believed babies should not sleep in complete silence. Spirits, apparently, lurked in stillness. So a bit of noisy crackling fires, murmuring, even singing was a way to keep bad energy away. Which makes your dad's snoring not just annoying, but also possibly protective. Historians still argue whether these cradles were more symbolic than practical. Were they truly used every night, or only for display when a midwife came over? Some cradles were intricately carved with animals or gods. Was that for sleep or status? Debates aside, one thing is clear, comfort was secondary to survival. You shift a little in your cradle and feel a sharp poke. Yes, the reality of early bedding. No duck feathers here. Just straw. Sometimes old cloth. Occasionally, moss or dry leaves if someone remembered to gather some. And did anyone wash this stuff? Maybe. But probably not recently. If you wet the bed, and let's face it, you're a child, you probably did. You might be set aside the next night. Not for punishment, but because your cradle needed to air out, which was code for smell less like a cabbage fart. And if your family was particularly worried about spirits or misfortune, you might be blessed or cursed depending on where your cradle was placed. Some Roman families believed east-facing heads made you smarter. Others just needed to keep you away from the drafty bit near the door. So, here you are, eyes fluttering as the fire crackles low. The straw itches. Someone nearby coughs in their sleep. A rat scurries behind a pot. But you're wrapped tight, anchored in your tiny wooden boat, bobbing through the night as if it were the Nile, the Tiber, or the Thames. You dream about warmth. About softer moss. About a world with mattresses that remember your body's shape. You wake with a jolt, well, not really a jolt, more like a gentle swing. Because you're not in a bed. You're suspended. Mid-air. In a sack. Congratulations, you're a baby in the Bronze Age, and your cradle isn't on the floor anymore. It's been hung from a wooden beam in the ceiling with woven ropes or animal sinew. Like the ancient version of a bungee chair. Why? Because the floor was cold, dirty, and often shared with chickens. Also, a swinging cradle helped you fall asleep assuming no one bumped it while walking past with a slushing jug of beer. In ancient Scandinavia, archaeologists found traces of what might have been tree branch cradles, literal limbs shaped into curved baby beds. You were gently rocked with the wind, or by someone nudging it with their foot while weaving wool. The idea sounds lovely until you remember how breezy and wolf-prone it was outside. In Mongolia and parts of Central Asia, babies were tied into flat board cradles, swaddled so tightly they resembled ancient burritos. A rope mechanism allowed the mother to rock the baby while spinning yarn, cooking, or possibly fighting off raiders. And yes, there was a hole in the cradle bottom connected to a guard to catch things, so you didn't have to be removed for, well, you get the picture. You wiggle your arms, or try to, and realize you were swaddled like a scroll. Ancient cultures believed it helped limbs grow straight, especially in Rome and Greece. Babies looked like stiff little sausages, all eyes and no motion. Historians still argue whether this was done for hygiene, social status, or just to prevent the child from flailing into the cooking fire. Probably a mix of all three. But the real secret weapon of ancient baby sleep: movement. Hammocks, backslings, walking cradles, anything to simulate the rocking rhythm of being inside a womb. One Mesopotamian mural shows a woman rocking a suspended cradle while chanting something that translates roughly to sleep, child, so I may sit. Timeless, really. Of course, not every baby had such luxury. In rural areas, babies might be laid on a straw mat beside working parents. If you're lucky, a sibling pokes you with a stick to check if you're still breathing. If you're very lucky, they don't sit on you while playing pretend donkey cart. In Japan's Edo period, some families used shared family futons on tatami mats. The baby slept between parents, wrapped like a scroll and covered with a heavy quilt. There wasn't much room to roll, so you had better enjoy sleeping like a brick. And then there's the slightly more fringe practice from certain Himalayan villages, placing the baby outside in a cradle on a sunny day to absorb warmth and mountain air while mothers did chores. Fresh air. Sure. Exposure. Also sure. Historians still debate whether this was more practical or spiritual in nature. Eventually, you drift off again because that's what babies did: sleep, cry, poop, repeat. And in many ways, that rhythm hasn't changed. Except now we have apps to track it. As you sway back to sleep, you can almost hear the soft hum of ancient lullabies, the creak of ropes overhead, and the distant clatter of clay pots. You're safe for now, nestled in your primitive swing. Just another sleepy bundle in the endless timeline of childhood. Easter again, rubbing your tiny ancient fists over your even tinier ancient eyes, and there it is, the sun creeping through whatever counts as a window in your century. Which means one thing: it's time to be awake. Not because your body feels ready. Not because you've had enough sleep. But because everyone else is up. And in ancient times, sleep schedules weren't yours to decide. In most early civilizations, bedtime was dictated by one overwhelming factor: the sun. As soon as it got dark, it was time to sleep. Not because it was cozy or relaxing, but because it was pitch black and lighting a room cost money, effort, and possibly a burned eyebrow. Oil lamps and candles weren't cheap, and fires needed constant tending. If you were still playing with your toy sheep when the light died out, too bad, your bedtime had officially arrived. Morning routines began at dawn. And if you were a child in ancient Rome, that meant being shaken awake just as the birds started squabbling, with a stern voice saying something like "Tempus fugit, time flies." You had to be dressed, teeth scrubbed with frayed sticks, and standing straight before anyone thought you might be lazy. Spoiler: kids had no right to laziness back then. In medieval monasteries, even children trained as novices had to rise for maidens, a prayer ritual held in the wee hours of the night, sometimes at 2 or 3 a.m. Imagine being 10 years old, yawning through late enchants while trying not to doze off on your hem scroll. But let's say you weren't a monk or a miniature Roman senator. You were just a regular child in an Anglo-Saxon village. Your wake-up alarm. A rooster. Or your mom banging a pot because someone let the goats out again. Historians still argue whether children had consistent bedtimes or whether sleep was broken up into chunks. Some evidence suggests a two-sleep pattern: people slept for a few hours, woke for chores or prayer, then went back to bed. Which means you, little listener, might have been expected to nap midnight while your parents stirred gruel or told ghost stories. Try doing that without a night light. And naps. Almost non-existent. Unless you were rich or sick, midday napping was considered indulgent. That explains a lot about the general grumpiness of historic populations. On some days, bedtime was more fluid. During harvest or market days, sleep could be delayed until every grain sack was stacked or every turnip sold. If a child complained, that was met with a pointed look and possibly the phrase, "When I was your age, I milked 3 cows before sunrise," even though they were your age yesterday. Now, for a fringe curiosity, in some ancient cultures, like among certain Indian communities, children were trained to adapt to polyphasic sleep, short naps throughout the day and night so they could stay alert for long journeys or rituals. Great for endurance, bad for REM cycles, and heaven help you if you slept in. In Puritan New England, oversleeping was sometimes seen as a sign of sloth, a gateway to moral decay. No pressure. Still, not every ancient culture was rigid. In many tribal communities, children followed the rhythms of the group, waking when others stirred, sleeping when stories ended, and dozing off wherever their heads landed. A cozy chaos of shared warmth and mutual exhaustion. So you, curled now in your lumpy straw bed, know one thing for sure: your sleep is not your own. The sun rules you. The rooster mocks you. And somewhere in the distance, someone's shouting your name, probably because it's your turn to feed the fire. You're awake now. Not fully by choice, of course. Your eyes are open because something smells off, and your backside is suspiciously damp. Welcome to the ancient nighttime peapot problem, a challenge that's older than written language and considerably smellier. See, in many ancient households, there was no hallway, no porcelain throne, No gentle blue glow of a motion sensor toilet light. There was a pot. Or a jug. Or if you were particularly rustic, a hollowed-out gourd. And if you were lucky, it was near the bed. If you were unlucky, it was under someone else's. Chamber pots were a universal solution to a very universal problem. Whether you were in ancient Mesopotamia or medieval France, if nature called after sundown, you didn't just stroll outside into the freezing dark where wolves and worse things waited. You reached for the pot. And children, well, they either had to be taught to use it correctly or risk a scolding and a bath they really didn't want. For toddlers, especially in cultures like ancient Rome or Ming China, there were tiny pots made just for them. Not because people were being cute, but because no one wanted to deal with accidents on a floor made of woven straw mats or polished clay. Still, misses happen. Frequently. And the punishment wasn't always harsh, but it was definitely humiliating. In some medieval households, if you peed the bed too often, your name might be jokingly changed to something like Puddlebottom for a day. Think of it as the old-timey version of a nickname you really don't want trending. Of course, some cultures tried to get ahead of the issue. In ancient Japan, parents sometimes trained children to go outside on a schedule weather permitting. And in ancient papyrus records hint that children were encouraged to sleep with a cloth between their legs, an early version of a diaper. Or, depending on how you see it, a really inefficient sponge. Now let's address the fear factor. Because the real nightmare wasn't using the pot. It was walking to it. Imagine being 5 years old, barefoot, tiptoeing across a dark room filled with siblings, furniture, fire embers, and the occasional lurking chicken. All while clutching your cloak and trying not to trip on your dad's boots. In Norse households, some children refused to go at night not because they didn't need to, but because they believed Natmara, a nightmare spirit, might be hiding in the corners. Historians still argue whether this fear was genuine superstition or simply a clever parenting trick to make kids hold it in. Either way, accidents happen. And if you were part of a large family and most kids were, you were probably sharing a sleep space. That means someone was always upset about being woken by the warm horror of someone else's midnight mishap. Fringe fact, in some parts of ancient China, it was common to keep lime powder or even ash near beds to sprinkle into pots for better smell control. A noble idea, except when someone mistook it for flour. By morning, the pot had to be empty. Guess who did it? Often, the oldest child. Which meant carting a sloshing, lidless container through narrow halls or down icy stairs. One spill, and your day started with tears, apologies, and a whole lot of scrubbing with vinegar or herbs. So the next time your plumbing makes that gurgling noise and you grumble about low water pressure, remember, you could be making a half-asleep dash to a wooden pot and hoping your sibling didn't already fill it. The sun is up now, fully, unapologetically up, and with it comes your one reliable joy, playtime. But before you imagine swings and stuffed animals, let's recalibrate expectations. You're in ancient times. Your toys are a little sharp. A little grimy. A little edible, sometimes. You roll over on your shared mat or straw pile and find a small object beside you, a carved bone dog. It's been passed down through 3 siblings, 1 goat, and an unfortunate incident involving a chamber pot. But it's yours now, and you love it like a modern kid might love a blinking plastic dinosaur that sings annoying songs in 3 languages. In ancient Rome, children played with miniature carts, dolls made of rags or terracotta, and even tiny swords, because why not combine playtime with battle readiness? Archaeologists have found ancient discs, spinning tops, and marbles made of clay, stone, and even sheep knuckles. Yeah. You could spend a whole afternoon flicking bits of a former lamb around a dusty yard and call it fun. Fringe discovery. In Viking settlements, children played with small wooden animals and wheeled carts, often decorated with intricate carvings. One toy horse had tiny holes drilled in the head, possibly to attach reins. Or maybe just to give a very early version of a hobby horse. Historians still debate whether these toys were for everyday use or ceremonial training. But let's be honest, most toys weren't made for you. You made them. A rock becomes a loaf of bread in your game. A stick becomes a sword, a staff, or a makeshift flute. Mud becomes soup, and soup becomes a reason to get scolded for ruining your only shirt. Group games were where the real excitement lived. Tag-like chasing games were common across many cultures, chasing goats, chasing friends, chasing chickens, sometimes unintentionally. In ancient Egypt, wall paintings show children doing handstands, cartwheels, and engaging in balancing games involving large ceramic jugs. Impressive. Sure. Dangerous. Also yes. There's a game in ancient Greece called Ephedrismos, where one child throws a stone at a target, and the loser has to carry the winner on their back. Imagine piggyback rides, but with more dirt and bruises. And in Mesoamerican cultures, there were early forms of ball games that children mimicked with balls made from tree sap, think ancient rubber, but with a side of danger. Toys also taught lessons. Dolls often wore miniature versions of cultural clothing. A tiny clay oven might have been a teaching tool for little girls, preparing them to cook actual food in actual clay ovens by age 7. You jiggle, but there's a good chance you'd already be helping to pluck chickens or stir porridge with a stick the size of your arm. Historians still argue how much free time children had to play, especially those outside noble classes. Some argue kids had long, unsupervised afternoons while adults worked. Others suggest children were expected to mimic adult tasks and play only in stolen moments. The truth likely depends on where and who you were. A fringe fact to warm your heart: in 14th century Europe, there's mention of a toy fair where handmade cloth animals and whistles were sold, some painted bright red or blue, with natural dyes. Even in tough times, someone was carving a duck for a child. So now, clutching your bone toy, you run off into the dirt path outside your home. You play. You trip. You skin your knee. You laugh. And when it's time to come in for chores or a scolding, you tuck your toy somewhere safe, probably next to a rock that pretends to be a secret treasure chest. Because even when the world is harsh and the straw itches, you're still a child. And play is how you make sense of it all. You're still clutching that bone dog. But now it's time to get serious, or at least, as serious as an ancient kid can get while running around covered in dirt and goat hair. Welcome to the original version of tag, but with spears, swords, and maybe a few bruises thrown in for good measure. Ancient children didn't just play to pass time, they trained. In places like Greece, Rome, and Northern Europe, games mimicked the adult world of hunting and warfare. Tag wasn't just tag, it was a mock hunt, where the hunter chased the prey with wooden sticks shaped like spears or swords. You'd be forgiven for thinking these kids took play way too seriously. But hey, training mattered. Imagine running around a muddy village square, dodging your friends' wooden weapons while trying to avoid being tagged dead. A little bruise. Sure. But you learned agility, reflexes, and teamwork. These were not gentle games. They prepared you for a life where a quick dodge could save your life or your honor. In medieval England, children played games called handball or mob football, chaotic affairs with dozens of kids trying to move a ball through village streets. These games could get so raw that local authorities often banned them because they damaged property or broke windows, or worse. In some cultures, like the Celts, children played a wrestling game called kala, which was as much about skill and strength as about fun. The best wrestlers often grew into fierce warriors, so you can bet the neighborhood kids took these matches seriously. Fringe tidbit: in some ancient Chinese villages, children played shuttlecock, a game involving kicking a weighted feathered object into the air repeatedly without letting it fall. Sounds tame, right? But players often practiced hours daily, building the stamina to outlast even adults. Now, for a bit of a dark twist, some Roman children were given wooden swords and taught swordsmanship very young. Losing a match might mean a mild slap. Winning was cause for praise. Historians still argue whether this early martial training was standard for all kids or just the elite. You also join the ranks of kids playing chasing games where the person wears a special hat or carries a small flag. The goal: catch someone and hand over the token, passing on the it status. Simple, yet competitive enough to inspire years of neighborhood grudges. Outside play sometimes doubled as preparation for adulthood chores. Boys might be encouraged to wrestle or hunt small animals. Girls might engage in balancing games with baskets or pots, improving their dexterity for domestic tasks. You remember the thrill of rolling a hoop with a stick, a game that spanned continents and centuries. It was cheap, portable, and surprisingly effective for tiring out rowdy children. Despite the rough edges, these games forged friendships, taught respect for rules, and, importantly, gave kids a break from hard work and stern scoldings. So, as you dodge your friend's wooden spear and laugh until your sides itch, you're not just playing, you're learning, surviving, and becoming part of a tradition older than your grandmother's stories. Alright, enough running around, now it's time for learning, which in ancient times was often code for work disguised as education with a side of mild public humiliation. You don't get to sit in a cushy classroom with colored pencils. Instead, you get to memorize huge slabs of stone or wooden tablets, maybe even while someone taps your knuckles with a reed if you get distracted. In ancient Mesopotamia, children of scribes learned cuneiform by copying endlessly. It was dull, repetitive, and the mistakes often led to sharp reprimands. There's evidence from Babylonian tablets that teachers had a surprisingly dark sense of humor, mocking poor students with sarcastic notes. Imagine your math teacher today writing "better luck next time" with an arrow pointing to your mistake, but much less friendly. Meanwhile, in Egypt, children of the elite attended schools where they learned hieroglyphics and religious texts. They sat cross-legged on the floor, slates balanced on their knees, copying the same lines over and over. And if your handwriting was sloppy, expect a flick of the reed. In ancient Greece, boys learned to read, write, and do arithmetic, but also to wrestle, play the lyre, and recite poetry. Education was about mind and body. Yes, you still got whacked if you dared to daydream or spoke out of turn. Historians still argue how harsh these punishments truly were, but accounts mention anything from stern looks to mild beatings. And for girls, education was mostly home-based, learning household tasks and obedience. Though in Sparta, girls got a surprisingly robust education running, wrestling, and sometimes even reading and writing. Talk about a culture twist. A quirky detail. In medieval Europe, some schools used tiny wooden sticks to discipline children who misbehaved, called birching. The same sticks might double as rulers. Multitasking at its finest. Some French scholars suggest that in some parts of ancient China, children learned Confucian classics not only by rote but also through calligraphy practice, believing that the art of writing shaped the soul. So, if your brush strokes were bad, your very essence might be questioned. No pressure. In many cultures, learning was a family affair. Younger siblings watched older ones struggle and absorb lessons by osmosis. Some kids were apprentices, learning trades like blacksmithing or weaving by doing real work alongside their masters. Forget recess or classroom was the forge or loom. While you might think that constant work and strict discipline sounds dreadful, these early education systems produced some of history's most influential minds. But also, probably a lot of grumpy kids with bad posture. So when you got caught daydreaming about your bone dog or your next hoop game, the teacher's finger was ready to jab, and the phrase "pay attention," or else was anything but a joke. You dream of a classroom where pencils don't hurt and playtime isn't punished. For now though, you keep scribbling, memorizing, and hoping for the end of the day. You're no longer the baby in the cradle or the kid chasing sticks. You're growing up fast. Now you're part of the workforce, the unofficial assistant adult in your family, which means chores, responsibilities, and yes, still plenty of scolding. In many ancient villages, older children, especially girls, are expected to babysit younger siblings. If the baby cried for too long, the older child might be blamed for neglect. That meant not just playing with dolls, but actual caregiving, feeding, bathing, and keeping watch while adults tended to heavier work. Boys often took on animal husbandry, leading goats, sheep, or cattle to pasture. You might think this sounds peaceful, but try corralling a stubborn goat that prefers eating the neighbor's crops. And don't forget the occasional encounter with snakes or wild dogs. One misstep, and you'd hear the familiar sharp voice of your father reminding you who's in charge. In ancient Egypt, children from farming families learned early how to harvest and thresh grain. Some accounts suggest children as young as 7 were involved in carrying heavy loads or stacking wheat sheaves. Not exactly playtime, but essential for survival. Younger kids often mimicked adult behaviors, carrying water, grinding grain with hand mills, or weaving baskets. These weren't just chores, they were lessons. Every task you performed was a step closer to adulthood. Fringe fact, in some Norse communities, children helped build houses by fetching tools and materials, often under supervision but sometimes on their own. Imagine a 5-year-old running with a hammer bigger than their head, dangerous, but apparently effective. Historically, historians still argue whether such chores limited childhood or gave children early independence. Some argue that being mini adults forced kids to mature too quickly, others say it built resilience and community bonds. Another harsh reality, with responsibility came blame. Spilled milk. Not the goat's fault, probably yours. Broken pottery. That basket was your job, so expect a tongue lashing. And if the crops failed, you'd better believe someone found a scapegoat. In many cultures, the extended family played a role. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, all helped supervise and discipline. So even if your parents were away, you were rarely free from an adult's watchful eye and their endless reminders. One more quirky tidbit. In medieval Europe, some families had a little master or little mistress title for the eldest child, who bore extra duties and privileges. It sounds fancy, but really meant more chores and more blame when things went wrong. So as you trudge after your family's goats, carrying a bucket nearly as big as you are, you wonder if the grown-ups had it any easier. Spoiler alert, probably not. And with that thought, you look up at the sky, longing for the evening's return, because even if the work never ends, the promise of rest and, maybe, a little mischief, keeps you going. Scoldings, those ancient echoes that follow every child through history, were as much a part of growing up as learning to walk or losing teeth. But if you think time out or a stern talking to was the worst, think again. Punishments could be surprisingly creative and often downright bizarre. In Roman times, misbehaving children were sometimes subjected to cold baths or had their hair forcibly cut to signal disgrace. The idea wasn't just to punish but to shame publicly. Imagine being the kid with half a head of hair at the market square. Medieval Europe took a theatrical approach. Parents sometimes forced naughty children to wear shame masks made of iron or would ridiculous faces with exaggerated features, designed so neighbors could easily identify the troublemaker. Today, that'd make you an instant viral meme, but back then, it was serious business. Fringe detail, in some Scandinavian villages, children caught lying might be tied to a wooden horse effigy and paraded around the village. Historians still debate if this was a real practice or a symbolic legend. Either way, the idea certainly strikes a nerve. Corner time. Forget it. The corner was for cowards. Instead, misbehaving kids might find themselves tasked with humiliating chores, like cleaning communal latrines, an unpleasant job that doubled as penance. In ancient China, Confucian teachings emphasized filial piety, and disobedient children risked public reprimands or being forced to bow repeatedly, a physically exhausting and humiliating punishment. Parents and teachers wielded bamboo sticks to correct behavior, sometimes with frightening severity. Yet, not all punishments were physical. Some were psychological, like withholding meals or privileges. And in some indigenous cultures, children were given scolding songs, repetitive chants meant to remind them of their errors, delivered in sing-song form that could last hours. Historians still argue how widespread corporal punishment was and how much it shaped children's personalities. Some see it as essential discipline, others view it as cruelty. You recall the sting of a wooden spoon or the cold shock of a bath, but also the burning shame of being singled out during village gatherings. That kind of memory sticks with you longer than any bruise. In one bizarre twist, some cultures believed that misbehaving children were cursed or possessed by spirits. Punishments included rituals involving herbs, chanting, or being made to wear protective amulets. Despite the harshness, these punishments came with a sense of community enforcement. Everyone was watching, judging, and hoping you learned your lesson fast. So, when your mother's voice rises and your siblings snicker, remember you're part of a long line of children who face the scolding storm, each carrying lessons about respect, obedience, and survival. You're finally settling back down, hoping for a peaceful night, when suddenly you hear a lullaby. But don't expect sweet melodies about moonbeams and sugarplums. Ancient lullabies had teeth. They were often more like stories of danger, ghosts, wolves, or starvation, all designed to keep you safe by scaring you just enough to stay still. In many cultures, lullabies weren't just soothing songs, they were warnings. In parts of medieval Europe, mothers sang about the nullaby, a horse-like demon who would snatch misbehaving children. The idea, keep still and quiet, or the nullaby might come for you. You probably wouldn't survive that, so better listen. Ancient Greek lullabies sometimes referenced the god Hypnos, the spirit of sleep, appealing to him to grant rest while warding off nightmares. These songs combined soothing rhythms with mythic imagery. The line between comfort and caution was thin. In Japan, some lullabies featured playful ghosts or spirits that might carry you away if you cried too loud. The blend of gentle melody and eerie story might seem contradictory, but it were. Maybe it was the psychological version of if you don't sleep, the boogeyman gets you. Fringe fact. Among certain Native American tribes, lullabies involved mimicking animal sounds, owl hoots, wolf howls, to teach children about the natural world while soothing them. Historians debate whether these sounds were more educational or spiritual. In parts of Africa, lullabies were often call and response songs sung by mothers and older siblings, mixing humor with advice. One common theme, don't wander off at night where the spirits might get you. Cute, but effective. Some scholars argue that the often dark themes in lullabies weren't meant to frighten, but to prepare children mentally for the harsh realities of life. Sleep was a vulnerable time, and knowing the danger seven in song was a form of protection. You might be surprised to hear lullabies mentioning wolves, starvation, or ghosts in the same breath as promises of love and protection. But ancient parents knew the world was a dangerous place, and their songs reflected that. And then there's the rhythmic rocking, the gentle hum, the soft tapping, universal comforts that transcended time and culture. Lullabies weren't just words, they were rituals of bonding and safety. So, as you lie swaddled in your ancient cradle, hearing a song that might make you shiver or smile, you drift towards sleep. Because sometimes, even the spookiest lullaby is better than the silence. You'd think bedtime meant no fun, but in many ancient cultures, festival nights turned the world upside down. Literally no bedtime. Imagine torch-lit parades, fire leaping, wild dancing, and a general permission to be as loud and mischievous as you wanted. Perfect for kids who'd been cooped up all week. In ancient Rome, festivals like Saturnalia flipped social norms. Slaves played games, masters wore bright clothes, and children could stay up late without getting scolded. It was chaos, but the good kind. You might have even caught a glimpse of a toga accidentally catching fire, followed by the usual screams and laughter. The Celts celebrated Samhain with bonfires and storytelling deep into the night. Kids roamed the village in masks and costumes, ancestors of modern Halloween, hiding from spirits or playing pranks on neighbors. For one night, the veil between worlds was thin, and so were bedtime rules. In medieval Europe, feast days were a time for merrymaking, music, and dancing, often lasting until dawn. Kids joined in or at least stayed awake to watch, delighting in the rare chance to break from rigid schedules. Fringe tidbit. In some African cultures, festivals involved ritual storytelling and communal games lasting all night. Kids learned history, morals, and social roles through participatory performances that doubled as entertainment. Historians still debate whether these extended celebrations were common across all classes or mainly among elites. Some evidence points to widespread participation, especially in agrarian societies where work was seasonal. For you, the child of an ancient village, festival nights were magical. No scolding, no chores, just wonder and excitement. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to sneak a bit of extra food or steal a spark from the fire. Of course, the next morning was rough. Parents might grumble about noisy neighbors or lost livestock, but the memories of these wild nights lasted long after the embers cooled. So if you ever get invited to a torch-lit parade, dance around a bonfire, or join a midnight feast, remember you're participating in a tradition as old as civilization itself where for one night, the world lets kids be kids. You think you're safe now snuggled in your lumpy bed after a wild festival night, but the ancient world had one more worry: superstition. Sleep wasn't just for rest, it was a battleground for spirits, demons, and bad luck. In many cultures, children were believed to be especially vulnerable during sleep. The famous evil eye was a constant threat if someone envied or cursed you. Your sleep could be disturbed, or worse, your health affected. To counter this, families hung charms near beds, amulets, herbs, or even dried animals' parts to keep the darkness at bay. Among the ancient Greeks, dreams were taken seriously. A nightmare wasn't just a bad dream, it could be a message from the gods or a sign of illness. Children were encouraged to sleep facing east, so the rising sun would chase away bad spirits. In some parts of Africa, ritual baths or prayers were performed to protect children from night visitor spirits believed to cause sleep paralysis or nightmares. These beliefs shaped bedtime rituals, from the way blankets were arranged to the timing of lights being extinguished. Fringe fact: in certain Himalayan communities, kids slept with protective talismans under their pillows to ward off ghost fingers that might poke them awake. Scholars debate how much these fears influenced sleeping positions and behaviors. Some historians argue that these superstitions were ways to explain common childhood ailments, night terrors, sudden noises, or even epilepsy. Others see them as cultural tools to instill obedience and cautious behavior. You've heard the warnings: never turn your back to the door, always say a prayer before sleep, don't leave the window open. Failing to follow these might invite trouble, whether real or imagined. And sometimes, it were. Rituals and superstitions provided comfort and structure in a chaotic world, helping children and parents feel safer at night. So as you pull your scratchy blanket up and glance nervously at the shadows dancing on the wall, you're not alone. For thousands of years, children everywhere have faced the dark with a mix of fear, faith, and hope. You might hope for cozy nights and soft pajamas, but ancient children mostly slept in whatever they wore all day, or worse, hand-me-downs that itched like a nest of angry bees. Luxuries like fluffy cotton or smooth silk were rare, reserved for the wealthy, and even then, sometimes saved for daylight hours. In ancient Rome, children's nightwear was simply lion tunic or woolen wrap. It wasn't meant to be stylish, it was practical, easy to clean, and warm enough. Socks? Barely a thought. Shoes? Absolutely not in bed. Medieval Europe was rougher. Most kids slept in layers of coarse wool or linen, often passed down from older siblings. These garments were stiff, scratchy, and sometimes smelled like the barn. If you were lucky, your parents let you keep your shoes on, because cold feet meant cold nights. Fringe detail: in parts of ancient China, silk pajamas existed but were typically reserved for the elite. Even then, they might only be worn in summer. Winter nights called for heavier robes made of hemp or cotton, which, while warmer, were far less comfortable. In Viking settlements, kids likely slept in their everyday clothes, often made of wool and animal hides. Those fabrics were durable and warm, but notoriously itchy. Imagine trying to drift off with the sensation of tiny needles all over you. Historians still debate when the concept of specialized sleepwear truly took hold. Some suggest it only became common in the 16th or 17th century, when textile production advanced and cleanliness became more valued. For children, the practicality of clothing outweighed comfort. Clothes needed to last, survive chores, and keep you warm enough through cold, damp nights. So you got used to waking up with creases, sweat stains, and a general feeling of being wrapped in a slightly soggy sack. Sometimes, kids shared clothing as well as beds, adding another layer of discomfort. One sibling's lice or fleas could quickly become everyone's problem. Yet, despite the rough fabrics and ill-fitting garments, these clothes carried stories: the stains of a harvest season, the patches from a curious scrape, and the smells of home. So, as you pull your rough lion tunic tighter around you, you accept the itchy truth. In ancient times, pajamas were a luxury, not a given. The night grows deeper, but you're not alone. You and your siblings share a single bed, a wide, straw-stuffed pallet that creaks under the weight of half the village. And somewhere nearby, the dog curls up too, its warm body a comfort against the cold draft sneaking through cracks in the walls. Sharing beds was the norm. In many ancient cultures, space was scarce and privacy even scarcer. Families slept together for warmth, protection, and, let's face it, company. You might find yourself wedged between your older brother and a goat, which wasn't as cozy as it sounds but did the job. In medieval England, straw mattresses were communal affairs, often shared by several children and adults. The occasional squabble over space was inevitable, as was the occasional stray sneeze or fart. But these close quarters fostered bonds that would last a lifetime. A fringe fact: in some Native American tribes, families slept in circular lodges with communal bedding arranged in a spiral, symbolizing unity and protection. This design helped everyone stay connected, literally and figuratively. Dogs, goats, and sometimes even chickens were common bedfellows. Their presence kept vermin at bay and added warmth. You might wake up to a wet nose or a warm tail, which was annoying but oddly comforting. Historians still debate the exact sleeping arrangements, especially in wealthier households. Some evidence suggests that nobles had separate sleeping quarters for children, while peasants made do with what they had. For you, sharing a bed meant less room to stretch, but more warmth and security. It also meant learning patience how to tolerate a sibling's snoring or a goat's midnight munching. Sometimes, you might wake to find your little sister had wet the bed. The smell was unmistakable and meant a midnight bath for everyone. Not fun, but part of life. Despite the cramped conditions, these shared beds were where stories were told, secrets whispered, and dreams shared. The night was less lonely, even if it was a bit smelly. So, as you nestle into the warmth of your chaotic bed, you find comfort not in the softness of the straw, but in the closeness of family and maybe the occasional goat nuzzle. You're no longer the restless child tangled in rough linens, or chasing wooden sticks. You're edging into adulthood, though still half asleep most days. Your apprenticeship, marriage plans, and responsibilities loom, but so does that familiar feeling, the ever-present possibility of a scolding. In many ancient societies, growing up meant stepping into adult roles quickly. Boys became apprentices in trades like blacksmithing or carpentry, learning not just skills but also discipline, often the kind that came with sharp words and harder lessons. Girls, meanwhile, prepared for marriage and motherhood, learning domestic crafts from older women. Yet, this education was strict, with expectations clearly set. Stray too far from those expectations, and the whole family felt the sting of shame. Marriage could happen early, sometimes in the early teens, meaning that childhood felt like a brief, fleeting moment. The idea of a prolonged adolescence is a modern luxury. Despite growing responsibilities, getting scolded never really ended. Grandmothers, aunts, and neighbors kept an eye on you, correcting missteps, reminding you of your place. Even as an adult, you were expected to conform to community norms. Fringe detail, in some cultures, initiation rites mark the official passage to adulthood, often involving ritual tests of endurance or skill. Success meant acceptance, but failure meant continued child statues and more scoldings. Historians still debate how much choice young people had in their futures. Some argue that familial and social pressures left little room for rebellion. Others see subtle forms of resistance in folk tales and songs. Even as your life became busier, the need for sleep remained, and often, it was stolen hours, squeezed between chores and social duties. You might have envied the toddlers swaddled in their cradles, sleeping without worries. But here's a comforting thought. Every ancient child, from the swaddled infant to the new bride, shared the same tired rhythm. They laughed, played, feared, and dreamed under the same stars. And as you close your eyes tonight, remember that you carry a legacy of resilience, a long line of sleepy children who grew up to shape the world. Now, take a deep breath. Feel the soft pull of sleep weaving through your thoughts. Let your eyelids grow heavy. The day is done. Tomorrow brings new challenges, but for now, rest. The ancient night is with you, calm, steady, and welcoming. Good night. Thanks for sticking with me through this ancient journey of childhood sleep, play, and scolding. Remember, no matter the era, kids have always been kids, groove around the edges, full of life, and craving a little comfort. Now, dim the lights, breathe deep, and let the gentle night carry you away. Sweet dreams.